are you, Ani? Good to see you.
Wonderful, wonderful. All set. You made it on time. You made 1 minute before 3.
Yeah, I've had a long day of speaking programs, and all of them kind of around similar topics there too. So it's really a pleasure to be back with you and the team here.
Great, great. With this, I would request John to introduce you.
Well, it's good to see you again, and thank you so much for making the time available. I know you're pretty busy at CSIS, and you are the lead person on the India-US relations at CSIS. So for those of you who don't know you, you are the senior advisor and you hold the chair in US-India policy studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies up in Washington, D.C., in Georgetown, I think, pretty much, I believe. And so in this particular position, you help frame and shape policies to promote greater economic interaction and business engagement between the two countries. You have been at CSIS for a good long time, since 2014, and you have spent 16 years working in a variety of positions to strengthen the partnership to which you are so committed between the United States and India. I note that you have been a director of South Asia at McLarty and Associates, well known to us, and you have other distinctions in your CV. I will not rehearse them. They are there for those of you who want to see it, but really we look forward to your sharing your insights, your cumulative insights gathered over a long period of time. Where is the US-India relationship going?
Yeah, thanks for that, John. Well, it really is a pleasure to be back with you and the team here. That bio was written when I joined CSIS, so it's been coming up on 25 years since I had my first job tracking the India. No, you read it right. Just the bio is getting a little outdated because I've been here good and long time. For me, it's been a real journey too. I mean, starting in '98, just after India tested nuclear weapons, and you had U.S. sanctions, and U.S. companies were running out of India about as fast as they could, to where we are today. The pace has been erratic sometimes, but when you think about the broad sweep and what's happened since those nuclear tests, it's pretty amazing in terms of commercial engagement, in terms of security engagement, and what's happened for people-to-people exchanges. Now, looking at kind of U.S.-India commercial relations and business relations with India, where things stand now, it's helpful to take kind of a step back and think about where we were before this government was elected. It was about 10 years ago. We were starting to head in towards national election. The Manmohan Singh government had really kind of lost, I think, some of the momentum they had on reforms earlier on, and you began to see policymaking really shift towards social protections and things like that. But new reforms were really kind of on the outs. You saw a lot of pressures that the United States was putting on trade matters, some other diplomatic matters, and the arrest of an Indian diplomat up in New York really triggered the relationship to go into free fall. Just 10 years ago, the bottom completely dropped out, to the extent that the Indian government was removing concrete barriers around the American embassy in Delhi, in an area where they offered a little bit of ad hoc protection for us. So that was just a decade ago. With the election of the Modi government, and of course, a lot of businesses knew Prime Minister Modi from his time running the Indian state of Gujarat. Everybody kind of thought that, well, he'd be, pretty effective in running around the world and trying to attract business, which he'd done very effectively for his state of Gujarat. But beyond that, major national level economic policies and trade matters, that's where a lot of people were kind of scratching their heads. And I think, at least in that first term, you saw the Modi government really focus and prioritize in 3 buckets of issues. I'll talk about trade matters, I'll talk about domestic economic reforms, and talk about foreign direct investment. On foreign direct investment, the government came out of the gates pretty strong. So for companies that are here, you've actually seen fairly fast liberalization under Modi of a lot of the existing foreign direct investment regulations. There still are some sectors where you've got foreign investment regulations. Maybe there's a cap on the ownership limit, or maybe there's other sub-regulations that impact foreign investors. But they moved about 40 different foreign investment regulations in its first 3 years in office, which is about double the pace of previous governments. And not only are they liberalizing the foreign investment regime, but actually his own personal engagement with foreign investors was something that was pretty novel. From my own work on the US-India commercial lane going back 25 years, previous prime ministers, when they come to the United States for the UN General Assembly or something, they call for the business community to have a couple of CEOs, but do it very quietly and discreetly. Come in the side door of the hotel, don't let anybody see you, things like that, because they didn't want to be seen as actually encouraging foreign investment because it was still a bit of a dirty word in India. I think Prime Minister Modi realized the country was well more than ready to actually encourage foreign investment and the job creation and all the other accoutrements that come with it. So you've also seen Prime Minister Modi engage in these huge bombastic affairs, filling up stadiums, not with diaspora, but also with companies, having these roundtables with international CEOs. And that's a very different look from what we've seen from previous Indian leaders. So foreign investment, moving on regulatory change and engaging companies and trying to sell them directly has been a major priority since the government first came in. On domestic reform too, you saw some big ones, again, particularly in the Modi government's first term, huge national reforms like the goods and services tax that breaks down all these state-to-state silos in terms of how they look at taxes on goods and services, as well as a national bankruptcy law that's going to help India's companies when they die to actually discharge assets and get them back in the marketplace. We've seen some great airlines and other major industries that have collapsed, and those planes just rot on the runway sometimes because they keep trying to breathe life back into it or it's locked up in courts. That's obviously very powerful assets that a great entrepreneur can take on and move with, but they can't do it if the planes have already been sitting, at the end of a runway in weather for 15 years without maintenance. So the bankruptcy and some sectoral reforms like on oil and gas were pretty important. Trade has probably been the most difficult area. India has a massive trade deficit with the world. India's trade deficit on bad years is up to 11 or 12% of GDP. We know here in the United States, some of the political pressures we got against trade right now, our trade deficit as a percent of GDP is only 2 or 3%. So India's is many multiples of that. So when the Modi government came in, they had a very vibrant services market. I think a very backwards agriculture market. And they really wanted to focus on modernizing manufacturing. At the time the Modi government came in, manufacturing was about 13% of India's GDP. And they set a target with this Make in India rallying campaign of getting that number up to 25% of GDP by the year 2025. Well, here we are 9 years later, not a lot of success. They've moved up 1 percentage point from 13% to 14%. But it does look like some of the reforms they put in place, might hold some hope. And you've seen some significant announcements recently, particularly from suppliers to Apple and the iPhones to set up big manufacturing in India. So not a lot of visible evidence yet that the manufacturing that Modi had hoped for is really kind of taking off. But we can count on a series of reforms and some singular investments that might point to the fact that they might have cracked a turning point. But overall on trade, the government has tried to provide a lot of protections to domestic industry. And initially that caused some consternation from foreign companies that felt that they were losing market access because of higher customs duties, because of local content manufacturing mandates that we saw early in Modi's term. Trade, though, we probably have seen the biggest turnaround. Starting about 3 years ago, the Modi government changed and began to veer away from protectionism and moving towards a mix of domestic support programs. They offer a lot of financial incentives to companies domestically that agree to pick up production. And that includes foreign companies that are willing to put manufacturing in India, but also signing selective trade deals. Every time that the United States and India have major talks, like the recent summit in Washington, I always get a few trade journalists that call me and say, how are we going to get India more excited about trade? And the fact of the matter is today, India is actually signing trade deals and the United States isn't. Now, the deals that India signed with United Arab Emirates or Australia, they're not major NAFTA-style trade deals that cover everything, but they do offer significant market access opportunity for companies in those countries. India has ongoing talks with a number of other partners, including Israel, the United Kingdom, Canada, even one with the European Union that's been going on for more than 10 years. But they expect they may conclude a couple more of these deals even before India's national election. So there, I think U.S. companies are getting left out a little bit because we've been a bit slower, I think, to move on trade, whereas some of India's other partners have been moving a bit faster when they see that opening, when they see that the Modi government is actually more comfortable with trade than they had been in the past. Reforms overall, though, I mentioned a couple of times on foreign investment and big domestic reforms. The Modi government got out of the gates pretty fast. Then you saw a bit of a slowdown. midway through COVID, because of the sluggishness that was already apparent even before COVID, but was certainly accentuated with the COVID lockdowns, the Indian government moved faster on some new reforms, including liberalizing foreign investment caps in some very strategic sectors like defense, insurance, and telecommunications. So again, the ability to access India as an investor continues to improve over time. Now, when we talk about where the state of the U.S.-India commercial relations are today, it's a bit of a tale of two different trajectories. When we talk about what's happening between our governments, and when you've got summits like the one that just took place, there still are a lot of fights and fighting over trade issues. India market access issues I brought up before, where they've increased customs duties in some individual sectors and things like that. Under the Trump administration, the announcement of emergency tariffs on steel and aluminum hit Indian manufacturers. Because of some of our trade disputes, we revoked a big trade preference program to India called the Generalized System of Preferences. So between governments, you probably still have a much longer list of disputes than you have positive conversations about the commercial relationship. So on the policy front, kind of a stalemate with a lot of problems. The one area the governments have found some complementarity, though, is talking about ways to improve trade in strategically important items. Critical minerals, rare earths, 5G and 6G technology, semiconductors, things like this, things that we both agree, irrespective of whether the jobs end up in either of our countries, we've got to stop relying almost 100% on China as the producer of those items. There you begin to find at least some area of complementarity between our two governments. And as we saw in the bilateral working groups, as well as this emerging discussion, what we call the Quad, between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia, the conversations about cooperation on strategic commercial items is really starting to prove and accelerate. So it may be kind of narrow, but at least we finally find some kind of basis for our governments to have more positive conversations about the economic relationship going forward. But that's just one side of the coin, right? What's happening in the policy environment. The other side of the coin of what's happening in the real world. And there the story is a lot more positive. Despite the headwinds and some of these trade pressures I mentioned, U.S.-India trade continues to break a lot of new ground and break new boundaries. To the United States, India is now our 9th largest trading partner. So they've broken into the top 10 and have really been increasing that over time. From India's perspective, the United States is India's top #1 trading partner in goods and in services. And in fact, it's the only major trading partner with which India has a large trade surplus. So from India's vantage point, trade with the United States isn't just a nice to have, it's absolutely vital. The top trading partner and the only major partner with which India has a trade surplus. So the United States, I would say it's still kind of a nice to have for a lot of companies. You look at the size of the market. They just passed China as the most populous country. They're expected to sustain 6% economic growth for the next decade. And when you think about where those numbers are going to and what you're going to see in 20, 25 years, every US company that wants to have a footprint on global markets has got to have a sizable presence in India. But that being said, it still is sometimes a difficult place to do business for some of the reasons that I mentioned before, and some others we can break into during the Q&A. So great on numbers in terms of investment, in terms of services trade, and in terms of goods trade, but a lot of policy disputes that I think still continue to ring the bell as sounding like they kind of define where the economic relationship is. But ask me, would I choose a good policy environment or good trade numbers? I'll take the numbers anytime, because that's jobs and that's goods moving back and forth. So that's great. John and Ani asked me to talk a little bit about the future. Now, India has taken a lion's share in terms of global flows for trade and services. And this weird little confluence of factors kind of came together that I happened to kind of be there sitting in the front row for going back 23 years. India created these dynamic technology institutes in the 60s and 70s, pumping out world-class technology grads into a market that didn't have a lot of jobs for them. That was kind of step one. Step two, in 1999, the Indian government unleashed a big telecom reform that dramatically brought down the price of international telecoms. And then step three was Y2K. For those of us old enough to remember that fateful night in December of 99 when we thought the world was potentially going to end, many companies, for the first time, were forced to send code to India to peer through and see whether or not there were inconsistencies when the computers switched over that were going to bring down global financial systems and things like that. And that really led to the acceleration of the Indian IT services market. So when we talk about the relationship today, the bedrock of US-India commercial relations by far still remains the IT service market. Most Indian workers that wake up in the morning and owe their livelihoods to a relationship with the United States, the vast majority of those people are in IT services. And those companies like TCS and HCL and others, they're moving up the value chain. It started off with a lot of call center work. And now, India may not be producing semiconductors, but they're doing a lot of the engineering work that goes into it. They're doing the engineering work that keeps the Boeing Dreamliner up in the air. They're doing incredible things that have improved quality of life here in the United States for a lot of citizens. So I think they'll continue to move up the value chain in IT services. But being able to throw a lot of bodies at it and keeping prices low is going to be tougher because the institutes in India, a lot of the engineering grads they put out aren't quite job ready. So it's been growing in terms of quality and a little bit less growth in recent years in terms of quantity. And I think that'll continue for the foreseeable future. I do think India's moment in manufacturing is approaching. It'll happen, as always, in a few state governments first, those that have been, I think, the fastest to improve infrastructure and remove a lot of onerous licenses, states like Gujarat, Maharashtra, Telangana down in the south. But I think more states, especially as urbanization continues, and the same kind of infrastructure that companies demand are the ones where a majority of voters sit. I think once urbanization continues, you're going to see those investments in cities and the kind of infrastructure that companies need. So I do think that manufacturing, it may not be the next best destination after China. Vietnam and Malaysia and some other countries may have gotten their act together a little faster, but none of those other markets offer the domestic market and the scale that India does. So I think even before everything in India is perfect, I think as companies look for optionality beyond China, and Vietnam got overheated pretty quickly, as did Malaysia, India will begin to crack off a little bit more of domestic manufacturing. But as more states kind of get in the reform business in India and improve quality of infrastructure, I think that'll begin to accelerate. The reform agenda on that point really does kind of lie with state governments. And here's another kind of positive for the business environment. State governments, there was just too much transition. When a state government in India would flip, the new one would come in, and a lot of times they would revoke incentives given to investors. State government stability has been dramatically improving. State government in India had about a 25% re-election rate in the 90s. That moved up to about 30% the following decade, 45% in 2010s. And today, over the last 5 years, a state government has a 68% re-election rate. So if you heard those horror stories about making an investment in India, having a state election, a new government come in and wreaking havoc, not honoring incentives that were offered and things like that, the chances of that happening have dropped pretty dramatically. So that's a really important step in the right direction. Urbanization, as I mentioned, is one of the things that I'm watching very closely too. Today, part of the reason that you don't have terrific infrastructure in a lot of urban areas in India is simply because city governments barely exist in India. State governments really kind of rule the roost, and they haven't devolved much power to city governments. So when you've got a state government that is driven to office primarily by rural voters that want to see things like free water and free electricity, that becomes the policymaking thrust. And cities are mostly used as kind of the piggy banks for tax revenue to be able to fund these services in rural India. And while it's great for people, it also means that cities are starved for the kind of infrastructure that investors need. And you do see urbanization happening. The real inflection point in India still is probably about 20 years away, when you'll have more urban residents across the country than rural residents. And that's when I think state level policymaking will really start to double down on infrastructure investments and modernization. That's going to make business a lot easier. But again, that's India as a whole, 1.4 billion people. Some states are already at that point. Some states will cross that threshold a lot faster. So when you're thinking about India as a place to invest or a place to trade into, the states that have been kind of at the leading edge on urbanization and reforms, those are the ones to target. I'm happy to talk through some of the ones that I've engaged that I think are at the leading edge of that. The last thing I'll talk about is, for those that are looking to expand business with India, what are the things to watch for that really kind of show concrete improvements in the business environment today? Number one is courts. Getting adjudication of disputes with your suppliers, with your customers. it can take years to get those resolved, even relatively minor disputes. It's part of the reason why they say, know your partners and trust your partners. It's not just a fine talking point, but the fact that you can't trust the courts for quick remediation of disputes. It is important to have that relationship with your business partners so that you can talk to them directly and try to resolve things directly when it's possible. Now, you do have a lot of pilot projects happening in India where they're trying to improve digital tools to clear these massive backlogs of cases. And if that takes root, I think increasing courts and increasing judges, that's a generational kind of thing. But improving technology tools to expedite court clearances of pending cases, that's something that's shown to have a real big impact and dramatic. So courts, there's a lot of things that can happen even beyond increasing judges and increasing the number of courts. Regulatory coherence. You still see regulators in India respond to individual consumer complaints, oftentimes with sort of snap judgments and new regulations, product controls and things like that seem to be a bit extreme. I think back a couple of years ago, there was a fire in a building in the state of Gujarat, and there was a small school that was run in one of the upper floors. And unfortunately, some people died in the fire. Well, people in New Delhi read that and said, oh my gosh, we can't let that happen. So they banned all schools in upper floors of buildings in the entire state, or the city state, which doesn't really feel exactly like the right cure for what they saw in another state there, right? You should have stricter regulation, but not just simply offering a one-note ban on schooling. And that's the kind of quick regulatory responses that you sometimes see to what is otherwise, something that wouldn't necessarily warrant that kind of a response. So regulatory coherence and decision-making, still some steps for improvement there. Corruption remains pretty endemic, and it can be extremely difficult to confront, partially because, it's a bit of a feature, not a bug, right? It's kind of condoned to a lot of extent, particularly by state governments, because it's used as a tool to pick up political funding. But, areas like getting licenses, land clearance and titles and electricity rates, you do see improvements as digitization improves. A lot harder to hide the truth when anybody across the country can get immediate access and kind of know the truth on these different issues. Also, continued progress in areas like energy, water, and effluent treatment. Those are obviously critical inputs for business to consider, especially if you're an investor. So these are some of the things I'm watching for improvements that I think the government can do, has a willingness to do, and hopefully will see over time. But again, the big inflection point is still about 20 years away when urbanization begins to drive decision-making in state governments. And that's when I think a lot of these things become a little bit more natural rather than one-offs that individual states do. So a lot of upside in this relationship. A lot of great things that are happening right now. The numbers kind of show Indian companies are coming here, US companies are going there. A lot more trade is happening in both directions, increasingly important there. So over to you, and happy to take any questions that folks have.
Well, thank you, Rick. As I was listening to you, several questions popped into my mind, needless to say. Out of China into India, why not? And what are key country risks that still prevail in the mind of investors going into India? You named a few: corruption, the slowness of the court system, regulatory incoherence. But are there other country risks that pop up in your mind? And how do you explain the lack of migration of manufacturing towards India from China? That is to say, the exodus, particularly of US firms, which has sort of slowed down, or might pick up again, I guess. Is there, relatedly, is there sort of a dynamic in opposition between outsourcing, IT services, and then missing the boat on manufacturing, leading to the chip factory that India wants?
Yeah. Out of China into India, I'll start with that one. I think a year ago when we saw some of these announcements by Apple suppliers, people thought that might be kind of the tip of the iceberg. But you also had news stories from just before that, where the two largest US auto manufacturers, Ford and General Motors, both announced a dramatic downscaling of what they were doing in India. So, the stories, like, everybody kind of focused on the positive, which is Foxconn and others, these big investment decisions. But there was also some substantial negatives that were happening there too, kind of, in the opposite direction around the same time. I listed off some of the challenges. India's subsidies for electric power, the way that they try to cover these subsidies for the poor is by overcharging industry. So when you talk about why not India, electricity rates are high, and the quality of that electricity is terrible in most parts of India. You know, unless you're going to build a captive power plant, or unless you're in one of these zones they've established, which has dedicated infrastructure. But if you're just looking to set up a manufacturing facility outside a city, plug into the grid and get reliable electric power, it's just not going to happen quite yet. And if you do get electricity, it's going to be at higher rates than what you get in some other markets. Logistics and infrastructure costs also remain extremely high in India compared to some of the peer markets. So, you know, with the poor quality of roads and slow time that trucks spend on the roads, ports as well, you know, some of these issues on port clearance and how long it takes, you know, time is money. And India fares pretty poorly in a lot of these parameters versus some of the other Asian economies with which they're competing for that money that's looking to exit China. You know, I mentioned corruption, which remains pretty endemic. It's you know, really impossible to acquire land and clear it, and do so without facing corruption. Now you know, you pay for one of the developers to do a lot of the dirty work and you turn a blind eye to it. But companies know that's just how business is kind of done there. And those companies don't want to have that kind of a reputational risk. You know, they'll still kind of avoid it. But again, digitization is improving transparency, so that's moving in the right direction. But the costs in India are higher, and regulatory change happens often. And corruption also meets manufacturers in particular in a different way. When you've got environmental regulators coming by and doing door knocks, and they'll shut down your factory. Now you can make them go away. We know how that happens. But if you don't want to kind of suffer that on a regular, consistent basis, it still can be a tricky market to do business in. So, but the ones that are choosing India, a lot of them are doing it. You know, a lot of major manufacturers are there. They're only servicing the domestic market for now. The same problems you've got with ports and things like that also means if you're looking at 1.4 billion consumers and you want to get your product in their hands and the ports aren't working that efficiently, et cetera, you might put manufacturing, but it's not what we saw in China where the manufacturing is feeding the global market. It's really a lot of manufacturers are going in just for domestic supply. Now there's exceptions, right? If we're talking about the sectors in manufacturing where India has had, you know, some real global success, take generic pharmaceuticals. You know, if you open up your medicine shelf at home and you look at generic pharmaceuticals you've got there, you know, more than half a chance it was produced in India or by an Indian company. Autos and auto components. You've got tractors being manufactured even here in the United States by Mahindra. You've got, you know, although it's through acquisition, Jaguar and Land Rover are now Indian-owned brands. Indian auto component companies like Bharat Forge, you know, they've got components going into practically every vehicle built in the United States. So there are a few sectors in manufacturing where India has shown real international success and capability, but those still remain kind of the exceptions rather than the norm. And a lot of manufacturers, they're really kind of testing the water for domestic production. Apple actually was indicative of that. You know, Apple was forced to do local manufacturing because to sell things locally, you need to have local manufacturing. And so they were forced to set up their first manufacturing, but now they're announcing, you know, dramatic expansion. So I think that might be the way this goes as well. Yeah. Some industries that come in there, they're going to find that maybe it was a little bit better than they estimated from the outside. Maybe things change over time and make the market a little bit more appealing. Maybe labor regulations, which I haven't really touched on, get relaxed somewhat. And they go in there for the domestic market. But over time, as the market improves, they start to realize that's going to be the leap off point for supplying in the region and maybe the world. So that's one construct I think is fairly likely in how India begins to take a bit of the pie kind of globally. I covered a lot of the business risks, but I think you know, risk of, you know, maybe some escalation with Pakistan or China, risk of politics and risk of domestic upheaval. You know, those are things to keep an eye out for too. But none of those would I rate as high enough to deter a decision if the numbers are right now. It's not to that level.
Well, thank you very much for a panoramic view of the China-India relationship, a tour d'horizon. I had other questions to ask you, but I think we have struck the magic hour. And I am in Savannah, Georgia, so I think I have colleagues who want to go and see the city. Thank you so much. We are really very appreciative.
Yeah, of course.
Annie, do you want to close us up and take us out?
Yeah. Well, Rick, thank you. As John correctly said, what a panoramic view. and very well-rounded thoughts about the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats for U.S. companies in India, as well as India's share of probably being third largest economy in next 10, 15 years, as it is growing with a 6% on an average. So chances are India and US are going to be, I think, bigger and better trade partners,
I hope so. I've staked my career on it, Ani. So I hope so. So let's make that happen.
Vested interest.
I think we want to get that number to 500 billion. That number, from 192 or 200, what they're touting right now. Well, with this, we would like to thank Rick Rossow and CSIS and Dr. John McIntyre and James Hoadley for helping us in producing this program. As Dr. McIntyre mentioned, we are recording these sessions, so we will be editing them, and it would be on Georgia Tech Cyber website and also available through myself, through UIBS in about 2 weeks or so. And I would like to take your permission to close the session and have a good rest of the week. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you again. Cheers.